the values and the education and the nationalism and the desire, the love for Iran, the desire to build a better Iran and a future for their country, it's all there.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fifth Afternoon Light Live for 2026, coming to you from the historic council chambers here in the Old Quadrangle at the University of Melbourne. Well, the past 2 months have brought home in a very tangible way the realities of geopolitics, global markets, and vulnerable supply chains. Australia may be geographically distant from the Middle East, but we are economically connected and, as we are learning, dependent on what happens there. The events of October 7 shocked the world and unleashed the worst examples of anti-Semitism we've seen since World War II. The puppet master of this anti-Semitism and the attacks against Israel is, of course, Iran. And it is the threat of a nuclear-powered Iran that led the US and Israel to launch its latest assault in February this year. Distanced by sanctions as an international pariah, many of us in Australia are really unfamiliar with Iran, its politics and its history. And it's that story that gives us context for what the world is witnessing right now. There are few people more qualified than Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert to provide the insights into Iranian politics, the inner workings of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or able to describe the conditions inside some of the world's most notorious jails. In 2018, Kylie was arrested at Tehran airport, accused of espionage, and imprisoned for 804 days. She was caught up in a deliberate strategy of hostage diplomacy. Since her release late in 2020, Kylie has been an advocate for victims of hostage diplomacy and wrongful detention abroad. She has described Iran as an open-air prison for its 84 million people. A reminder that behind all this geopolitics lies a people grappling with repression, resistance, and an uncertain future. Now, as always with our Afternoon Light Lives, Kylie and I will speak for 30 minutes, discussing the issues and then open up to your questions. Well, Kylie, welcome to Afternoon Light.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here, and what a period of history we are living in. And I guess, in a way, who would have thought, 10, 15 years ago when you were studying Iran and you've been passionate about Persia and Middle Eastern politics, that your area of study would not just become part of your own personal story and a hugely, I think, formative part of your story, but also the number one topic of conversation for our economists, our politicians and everyday people at the petrol pump.
Yeah, in a way, it's hard to fathom that this has happened and now, why now, the timing in particular. But also, I remember being an undergraduate student of Middle Eastern studies in the UK back in the late 2010s and having this exact scenario discussed, especially with respect to the Strait of Hormuz. And at that time, it was pre-nuclear deal, pre-JCPOA, but already 2009, 2010-ish, they were on track to potentially looking at negotiating that deal. And they'd been in discussions with Iran for years prior. So this context was often flagged as a danger, something to be avoided. And in a way, it kind of blows my mind that we've ended up there in 2026.
Yeah, it's interesting with strategic thinking how there's a lot of prognoses about what's going to pass, for example, a clash over Taiwan in the future, but they always seem a little bit hypothetical. And yet, as you say, we are actually in the midst of what was for military strategists a hypothetical that is true, that is real, that we are dealing with now. And we can see the absolute wickedness of the problem too, of dealing with the military context, but also the economic context of this and the politics of Iran too, which is just incredibly difficult for us here in the West to understand.
I think it's often difficult for Iranians to understand, frankly, just keeping score of who's dead and who's alive. Yeah. And then there's a lot of conspiracy theories swirling even around those who are ostensibly alive, like Mujtaba Khamenei, the current supreme leader. We haven't seen or heard of him. So is he even alive? Is he in a coma somewhere? We really don't know. And Iranians also don't know. So the sort of domestic context inside the country is quite interesting right now. But also I think there's a real danger that however this current war comes to an end, and an end I will put sort of in inverted commas because it's possible that we might see another round of conflict in the future, there's a real risk that this is going to end up in a very similar place to how it began, just with an even angrier, more volatile and more hardline regime than we had before that might be even more inclined to take it out on the Iranian people. So, obviously big dangers for them. But that many of the main reasons for Trump and Netanyahu going to war might not be resolved at all. And that's pretty risky and dangerous for the world economy now, as we've discovered, but also for Iran, for its internal stability, for its people, for human rights there, and for the entire region, Iran's neighbours as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Who are feeling this, very much more so than they, I think, would have expected. Kylie, last year when the bombings on the nuclear facilities took place, I mean, what was your reaction to that? It sounds like it was a surprise that it actually had taken place.
At the time, it was interesting. It's certainly interesting to compare Trump back then and today, and it feels like a million years ago, but of course it hasn't even been 12 months. Trump entered the 12-day war that Israel initiated at the very last moment. There was all this dithering for a couple of days. Will he or won't he send those bunker-busting bombs to detonate Natanz and remove that nuclear facility entirely? And you had all these right-wing influencers, MAGA influencers in the US and others pushing him not to enter the war at all. And obviously the Israelis were urging him to do so. And eventually he did, and ultimately perceived it as a success, and that might have played into his decision this time around. But that more conservative approach to war and that sort of posture that Trump had long adopted of being a peacemaker, quote unquote, it's kind of gone out the window this time. And I'm quite perplexed by that dramatic shift that we've seen from Trump. And the nuclear, this time around, in my view, nuclear was a bit of an excuse. Right. Iran wasn't on the brink of developing a nuclear weapon with all of that nuclear material buried under the ground. It wasn't imminent in the same way that it has been in the past. Obviously, we don't want them to have the nuclear material, and that's very dangerous, especially when they're on the warpath and are very, very aggressive and assertive right now. And potentially after that 12-day war, they have an interest more so than ever in getting a nuclear bomb. They weren't any closer to it now than they were before the 12-day war of last year. So I do think, while it is a big deal and a big issue, it doesn't really explain the timing this time around.
Yeah, well, and there's a lot of speculation about that, and even Secretary of State Marco Rubio's statements around the reasons for the latest escalation are different from the President of the United States statements. So we all can endlessly speculate. But so the people in charge in Iran, and that's sometimes a little hard to judge, but most commentators are saying it is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps rather than the President or the Speaker. You, of course, have a very personal experience of the Guard. Can you explain what happened to you in 2018, how you came to be in Iran and what caused you to be arrested?
So I was a lecturer here at the University of Melbourne in the Asia Institute, and I was invited to Iran by an Iranian university. This was in the sort of dying days of the nuclear deal. There was this brief opening up economically, but also in terms of academic scholarship in Iran following the 2016 JCPOA. There was a couple of years there before Trump pulled out of the deal where more liberal-minded Iranian institutions were making an effort to try and open up to the rest of the world. And some of you might remember sort of the heyday of that period where there was talk of, McDonald's is going to go and open up in Tehran or something. And, obviously that never happened. But Western companies were thinking of going and doing business in Iran as well. It didn't last long, but it was in that context that I was invited to come to this international conference, symposium. It was in English. It was designed to appeal to European and English-speaking academics. There were no Americans there for obvious reasons, but there were others from all over Europe and Australia, Canada, etc., to go and have academic exchanges with our Iranian peers and I guess see a fascinating part of the world that had kind of been shut off to us for a while there. But unfortunately, I accepted the invitation and the trip was approved and I had to go through quite a rigorous process to get it approved. Trump pulled out of the deal before I left for Iran, and I made the silly mistake, I guess, of thinking I'll still be okay. The hosts assured me that everything's fine.
Were you worried? at all? I mean, did you say
I
goodbye to your
mean,
family and think this is a risk? Or?
no, I mean,
No.
it's not something I would have wanted to sacrifice my life over, going to an academic conference. I don't know whether that's worth
There are some academics in the room with us, and I mean, they may quibble with that. But
well, yeah, life or death,
Yeah.
high stakes
Yeah.
stuff, usually at academic conferences. No, I mean, I didn't think it would be an existential risk to my security. Otherwise, I would not have gone. Obviously, I did a risk assessment. That was part of the formal process. But also you do one inside your own head. I mean, you think even who you're talking to when you're on the ground, both in order to not expose any local interlocutor to any security risk from talking to you, but also for your own security. So you have that, of course, it's front of mind. But I didn't really feel for most of my time in Iran that I was in any danger at all. And everybody was very friendly and hospitable and welcoming. And certainly the host university was thrilled to have these foreigners visiting and kept wanting us to do photo ops everywhere and sort of wheel us out, look at our international outlook at our university kind of thing. So it was a success from that perspective. But I got extraordinarily unlucky. And I actually think it was somebody at that conference who was monitoring. There would have been 100% people from the regime monitoring this international exchange and who was talking to whom and what was going on. And I think it was somebody involved there that flagged me with the IRGC for extra checks.
And you had at the time an Israeli husband. Do you think
Yes.
it was because of that personal relationship, or was it something you might have said at the conference?
No, they didn't know about my husband because my husband lived in Australia and he was born in the Soviet Union. So he wasn't obviously an Israeli, and they didn't know that he had that passport as well as a Russian passport and an Australian passport until I'd already been arrested.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it remains a mystery to you, really, what caused you to be flagged as a security concern.
It doesn't remain an absolute mystery in that I know the individual. I'm pretty sure I know the individual who did it, who was working with the IRGC for some reason. But why me? I'm not sure.
So you're arrested at Tehran airport and you end up in Evin prison, which is one of the world's most notorious prisons. I've read descriptions, I've seen photographs at least of it being bombed. It looks absolutely awful. Your descriptions of it are awful. I mean, what was it like? You end up there, you're being interrogated. You know, having been a student of Middle Eastern politics, that this is not a great place to be at all.
Well, I didn't actually know where I was at the beginning. And actually, I didn't know who had arrested me either. I didn't know it was the IRGC. There are a number of armed and security actors in Iran, of which the Rev Guards, the IRGC, are probably the dominant, most powerful actor, but there are others. Ministry of Intelligence, which is the government side, intelligence operations, they also arrest foreigners and do hostage exchanges for foreigners. And there are a number of other groups too. So I didn't actually know who'd arrested me and where I was. I think I would have had an epic meltdown if I knew I was in Evin prison, but I actually didn't know that either until probably a couple of weeks after I'd been put there. And that was when other prisoners, I was able to establish kind of a covert method of communication with another couple of cells down the hall from mine. I was in solitary confinement and they told me that I'm in Evin prison. So I didn't even know that. So I think that complete ignorance of what was happening to me actually protected me a little bit psychologically.
You've probably been asked this a million times before, but when I read your accounts and hear you speak, I guess naturally think, how would have I reacted in that situation? And I don't think I would have reacted well at all. How did you cope?
I mean, I didn't cope, not for the first few weeks. It's, you're going crazy. I mean, they put me in solitary. This wasn't immediately after my arrest. I'd been in a kind of a hotel, for want of a better word. I was imprisoned in a hotel room that was under the control of the Revolutionary Guard for about a week. And then they made the decision to put me in Evin. So I kind of had that 1 week transition knowing I was in deep, I'm not going to swear, but trouble prior to being there in that cell. But when they put me in the cell, I mean, it was so tiny. It was about 2.5 meters squared with no window, no natural light, LED light like this one on above my head 24 hours a day, no furniture, no stimulus whatsoever, nothing to do, just sitting there staring at the walls, everything in a foreign language I didn't understand. Nobody spoke English. Nobody explained anything to me. And then, getting hauled off to interrogation, blindfolded and made to wear a chador and a hijab and all of this other stuff and bundled off down the hall into an interrogation block.
Were you interrogated in English?
Yes.
Yeah.
In broken English by, Rev guards who God knows what education level they actually had. Their English was, it depended who it was. At times I actually encountered Revolutionary Guard whom I believed were educated in America and had like perfect English American accent, clearly had spent time abroad. But at the beginning, the initial interrogations were people who probably never left Iran in their life and had probably only a medium level of language ability. Yeah.
You were there for 804 days, so over 2 years. You were released as part of a deal. I think 3 Iranians were released from Thailand in exchange for you. I mean, it was obviously a horrific experience, but you would have learned a lot about the Guard and Iran through that time. What were the conclusions you drew from your contact with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in those two and a bit years?
Yeah, so I got to know many of the Rev Guard. I mean, we're talking the Revolutionary Guard's intelligence branch, intelligence organisation. These are the ones that I would meet with daily sometimes. There were many factions and, I was in a facility called Dualif, which was actually a Revolutionary Guard interrogation facility inside Evin Prison, but separate from Evin Prison. So sort of higher security and no rule of law whatsoever. They could do whatever they wanted. It was kind of a black site. I was kept there for 23 months and then I was sent to a public prison elsewhere after that. So the people who were working in the prison were Revolutionary Guard members as well in this Dualif unit, not Evin Prison more broadly. The women, because everything's so gender segregated, I got to know a lot of Revolutionary Guard women because they were the prison guards. They were the transfer guards. They were the medical, transfer and court transfer people. And also there was a woman who sort of amusingly, I was always told it was for my security, I guess to protect me from the male interrogators. There was a woman who would always sit at the back of the room whenever I was taken to interrogation to ensure that I'm not alone in the room with the men. Although I've heard plenty of stories from other prisoners that this role would often help the men to assault the female prisoner at times. So she was not really on your side, but she was supposed to be there, I guess, to prevent some kind of assault on you. And so I got to know many of these women, as well as my male interrogators and male head of my case and other figures, some judicial figures within Evin Prison as well. I met on numerous occasions. And then others I would meet, like bizarrely, I met Bagheri Qani, who is now one of the negotiating team in Islamabad, and Araghchi, the foreign minister. I've met him as well. I mean, I've met the head of the IRGC intelligence organisation, Hussein Tayeb, who's since been removed from his position, and the guy that took over from him was assassinated as well. So I've met like some pretty senior people because they wanted to come and chat with me, and I'm still not really sure why. But it was interesting. So yeah, my impression of them, it really depended who I was talking to and their seniority. Many of them had very little security training or understanding, despite working for an intelligence organisation. I got all kinds of info and detail out of them, especially once I learnt Farsi. The women would be kind of on my side sometimes and would whisper me tidbits and give me info. Once I'd learnt the language and could properly communicate with them, oh, you're going to be released over the weekend, or my uncle or my brother, they all had a senior male relative in the organisation. It was very much in the family. This person in my close family circles told me this thing's going to happen to you. You're going to court next week or whatever. So yeah, some of them were remarkably open and not security conscious and friendly. Some of them, became almost friends with me. Others were cruel and heartless and got off on mistreating prisoners. Others were playing mind games constantly that you just had no idea if what they were telling you was true or was some kind of mental game they were doing for the hell of it, or to try and push you into, manipulate you into doing something or other. So yeah, the mental aspect of surviving for me was the toughest, especially dealing with these guys. I mean, it really depended on the character involved, but some of them were just really, really tough to live with.
You have described the conspiracy theories that a lot of these guards have about, what America's up to, UK, Australia and others. Can you give some examples of what they believe that, clearly untrue?
I mean, I once sat down, I became quite friendly with the chief interrogator after my conviction when they weren't trying to get info out of me anymore. They were actually trying to recruit me to work for them. And I once sat down and just like rattled off a list of random conspiracies that came into my head. And he basically signed up to all of them, like everything from JFK to the moon landing to September
The dinosaurs
11.
are made up? Yeah.
I didn't, I'm sure, Islamists don't tend to believe in prehistoric history.
Of course, yeah.
So I'm sure they would sign up to that too. But yeah, September 11 was an inside job. All this, I mean, the Jeffrey Epstein thing, they are fully, like the number of conspiracy theories I've seen coming out of Iran about Epstein and in Iranian propaganda right now during this war, they're fully signed up to all these crazy conspiracies. So it's something in the Iranian psyche. I think it's a living under an authoritarian regime thing as well. It's not just the Rev Guards on the street. Ordinary Iranians are often more likely to express belief in conspiracies too. And I think it's just because you live in an environment in which you can't trust anything the government tells you. You can't trust the official facts. You've got propaganda coming at you all the time. So you're just instinctively mistrustful of any information after a while. And that's maybe why the conspiracies breed quite quickly in Iran.
One of your interrogators presented you with a piece of paper with a list of names and addresses of Jewish institutions, including here in Melbourne. And of course, we've now have ASIO revealing that it was the IRGC who was behind some of the attacks on synagogues in Australia and Jewish community members in Australia. So they are active here. Did you get a sense that they were particularly interested in Australia, though, beyond this list of names and addresses that were presented to you? Or was Australia a place that they thought about?
Australia did not feature prominently for the IRGC at the time. My interrogators didn't know much about Australia, and I would say initially they had quite a positive view of Australia. They would make the usual jokes about kangaroos and koalas and whatever, like you sometimes meet foreigners abroad and they try out an Aussie accent or whatever. That was their kind of approach, bizarrely. But as time went on, I think as they began to explore prospects for some kind of deal with Australia for my freedom, then they started to drill down into, okay, what do we want from Australia? What grievances do we have with Australia that we can utilise in a deal of some sort? And so one of them, there was a woman called Negar Qodqani who was arrested in Adelaide, imprisoned. She gave birth in prison or in a hospital, but while imprisoned, and was ultimately extradited to the US for breaking the sanctions evasion on behalf of the Iranian regime. This was back in, I think, 2019. They really fixated on her case. She must have been passing this info to the IRGC, I imagine, or they had some kind of relationship with her. And I know she was informing on Iranian Australian community members as well, because I've had these community members tell me that. And so this woman, they initially, I think, wanted to swap me for her. They wanted the Australian courts to decline to extradite her to the US and instead send her back to Iran in exchange for me. And they really spiraled on her case. And I remember they were ranting about Australia to me in one interrogation session, claiming that she had been forced to give birth in her prison cell without any pain relief, without any medical attendance, totally bananas stuff that was absolutely not the case. I mean, I've even checked. She gave birth in a hospital, probably with a policeman outside the door, but she was attended by medical professionals and, her baby was healthy and there was no problems. But they really created a story out of this. And for a while, that became the main anger point for the IRGC with Australia, from what I could hear. But then obviously later on, they would say things like Australia's a lackey of the United States and whatever the US does, Australia's also complicit or responsible in that. And you'd hear the usual stuff from them too. But yeah, they never seemed particularly focused on Australia. I think it's also important to note that the anti-Semitic attacks they'd been commissioning in Australia were not exclusively targeting Australia. They were doing it in Europe. They've been doing it in North America, Canada, allegedly as well. So I think it was a more across the board, let's target all the Western countries approach rather than something that was particular to Australia.
So when ASIO finally announced that they did suspect the IRGC was behind the commissioning of these anti-Semitic attacks, including the firebombing of the Adass synagogue here in Melbourne, you weren't surprised then that they had looked to Australia and seen an opportunity to foment more anti-Semitism and attack Jews?
I had suspected for a long time after everything blew up online following October 7, and I saw a real shift in sentiments in the online spaces toward a narrative that seemed to me eerily similar to the IRGC's narrative that I had heard from them for, years in their custody. I came to know their mentality and the way they saw the world. And a lot of the stuff I was seeing online just seemed to be very close to that. So I had long suspected that there was a state-sponsored online disinformation campaign twisting sort of the Palestine narrative to fit Iran's view of the world and wheeling anti-Semitism into that. Unfortunately, it comes, hand in hand in the mind of the IRGC and the Iranian regime. Their views on Israel and their views on Jews can't really be separated. And I spoke to them with length about Israel and about Judaism. They were quite curious. One of them was learning Hebrew and would sort of speak to me in bizarre pidgin Hebrew, only using masculine grammar because he'd never spoken to a woman. And all of his Hebrew learning was from men. And so he didn't know how to use the feminine grammar to speak to a woman. So there was a lot of very interesting exchanges about this subject with them. And it's clear to me that they're deeply anti-Semitic. And again, it's another conspiracy theory for them, the idea that Jews are controlling the world and are pulling the strings in the United States. And, the US foreign policy has long been influenced by the Jewish lobby. And all of these ideas are just standard, IRGC thinking. And so a lot of what I was seeing online seemed to sort of mirror that. And obviously a lot of it's organic as well. And unfortunately, people hold those sentiments in our society too. But it seemed to be amplified, perhaps, by some state actors, one of which is Iran.
Why do you think the Iranian propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda, has been so pervasive in the West?
I think they did a really excellent job of tapping into existing ideologies or worldviews that had been percolating away for decades now, some of it coming out of the academy, some of it very popular in, circles that might have been socialist or Marxist in the past and have shifted as that's fallen out of favour post-Cold War and grasped onto sort of a more anti-imperialist mindset. And so they kind of grafted onto that rather than created a new ideology or a new manner of thinking. Third worldism as well. The founder of the Islamic Republic, Khomeini, was a third worldist. If you look at a lot of his speeches and writings, and even look at their meme game right now in this war. I mean, they're masterful at this stuff. Give credit to them. They've done an excellent job. All of those Lego clips and, the pink missiles with the sort of weird feminist chic but wearing full chador that they've got wheeling out these poor women to pose next to pink missiles and all of these things they're doing. It finds traction and Trump's a troll as well, of course, but the Iranians are kind of beating him at his own game when it comes to trolling and memes. So they're really good at the propaganda and the misinformation. And I think when it comes to anti-Semitism and Israel, they were able to plug into an existing zeitgeist and kind of operationalize what was already there and move it in the direction of some of their ideological points.
Yeah. We are now at our Q&A section of our Afternoon Light Live. So I'll go to our first question from Andy Campbell. To what extent might the United States' continued blockade following indications that Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and this is all very movable, so who knows what's happened in the last 10 minutes. To what extent has that blockade have been intended to prolong the economic impact on China of the Strait's closure? I mean, this is all interrelated, I guess. Yeah.
China's role here has been really interesting. I don't think there's been much economic impact on China really so far. I mean, they have a massive reserve. Australia perhaps should learn something from the Chinese, certainly about long-term strategic planning, but also they have been trying to get energy self-sufficiency, I think, long-term, and really they've got a massive reserve. So having these tankers over the last week or so be blockaded, because obviously during the Straits closure, it wasn't really closed. It wasn't closed to Iranian shipping or the friends of Iran that it negotiated with. It was still sending its tankers to China until very recently, and the US decided to blockade. So I don't think it's been very impactful so far. Obviously, the Chinese would prefer that strait be open and that, oil would continue unimpeded in their direction. But I don't think it's enough pressure just yet on China for it to actually step up and push Iran to change its behaviour. There's been reports that it's had conversations with Iran and perhaps was impactful in the previous Islamabad talks in getting Iran to attend and come to the table, but I don't think there's sufficient pressure on Beijing.
It's a mystery why the US didn't blockade the Iranian ports straight away, but I guess we'll all be experts on this in hindsight. But the strategic failures on the US side and this military entanglement seem quite large. A question from Andrew Knopfelmarker. Does the theocracy regime have any genuine support from any section of the Iranian population as we speak?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a rump of estimates sort of range from 15 to 20% perhaps. I wouldn't go above 20% of the population that are sort of dyed-in-the-wool hardline.
Would they be
supporters.
older members of the population, do you think?
No, there's a really ideological cadre of besieged members, which is the feeder kind of volunteer militia that feeds into the IRGC. You know, they're active on the streets, they're active in universities, other social settings. There's been a lot of reports of child soldiers, essentially, children being recruited in checkpoints inside the country since this war has begun. 12-year-old boys, youths mounted with machine guns and etc. pictured in the streets. So that small rump of support is very ideological and they're definitely indoctrinating the next generation. In fact, if you look at the IRGC, the younger generations of IRGC are more hardline and less pragmatic as a whole than the older ones who might have seen action in the Iran-Iraq War or in the revolution itself in 79.
A question here from Tom Switzer. Kylie, there's no question Iran has been badly damaged by the conflict, yet the Islamic Republic has probably survived. Do you think that Tehran has more leverage today, most notably via the Strait of Hormuz, than it did before the US-Israeli attack on February 28? What can the US and its allies do to keep it open?
Yeah, unfortunately, it does seem that they do have more leverage than they did before right now, although we don't know what the wash-up of this is going to be. They have been weakened considerably, militarily. Also, a lot of long-standing top leaders, people like Ali Larijani, have been taken out that would be difficult to replace in the same way. I mean, even the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, if Mujtaba is even alive, they don't want pictures of him or videos of him. He's not making speeches. We haven't heard his voice. So clearly his health situation does not permit that. He could just be used as a puppet, essentially, for military and IRGC commanders behind the scenes. But not having that strong iron fist rule of a supreme leader could lead to cracks in the regime. We've already seen some skirmishes and some disagreements between senior leaders already, but it could, when the war comes to an end, lead to even further cracks. So the regime has been destabilised by this, but certainly this is a trump card, the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, this is something that's been wargamed for decades by various militaries. The Gulf states have long been warning and have long been worried about this eventuality. Now that a precedent has been set, do you think they're going to give up that trump card? Even if they reach an agreement, they're still going to have that there sitting on that trump card in the future as a deterrent. So
what would it take to get them to, say, relinquish the nuclear program for 5 years? I think that was one of the terms of the negotiations the other day in Islamabad. I mean,
5 years, I'm sure they would agree to that, frankly. Like, they'll drive a hard bargain. They're good at that. But 5 years is nothing. I mean, again, this is a theocratic regime, doesn't have elections, not meaningful ones. It's got a fig leaf parliament, but they're in it for the long haul. I mean, they looked to the long term. This was their approach to the JCPOA as well. This was the long-standing criticism. It had these sunset clauses. Iran is looking long term. It can wait it out. It can wait 15 years and then go after further nuclear enrichment. So 5 years is nothing to them. I think that's something they are willing to be flexible around. The question is, no nuclear enrichment at all, period. Get rid of all of your material. Allow inspections to ensure that you don't develop it again. This kind of thing is more of a red line for the regime. But further sunsets and further, pushing the date out by a few more years, I do think they will give ground on that.
A question from Stephen Carter. From your time inside Iran and from what you observed of ordinary Iranians' relationship to the Islamic Republic, do you think the theocratic system faces a structural legitimacy crisis that is fundamentally irreversible? Or does the regime retain enough adaptive capacity through repression, patronage networks or selective reform to survive the current generation of dissent?
That's an excellent question. And I do not think that this regime has the adaptive capacity to survive the groundswell of dissent that we have seen. It's reached a point of no return. The regime cannot reform itself and it cannot claw back those people it's lost. It's been losing even more people in recent years. You know, in the 2009 Green Movement, you saw what was essentially a debate within the system. Where's my vote? That was the slogan. It was a disputed presidential election, but people by and large weren't disputing the system itself. That has very rapidly really degenerated into get rid of this regime. We don't want any of these guys, reformers, so-called moderates, whatever, who cares? They're all part of the same system, whole scale, let's get rid of them all. And I think you can't really change people's minds once they've made that decision, in particular because they've paid a very high price for these views. Literally the blood of their relatives, their own blood. The number of people this regime has killed, the massacre in January alone, I've seen Iranians online marking 100 days since that massacre, still mourning. We've forgotten, the news cycle's forgotten that and moved on so quickly. But far more people were killed by the regime in just a couple of days in January than have died in this war and the 12-day war of last year combined. And in such a brutal and devastating way. And, once your family members have been killed in the streets, you're not going to come around to this regime's existence, are you? You're going to double down on your position of opposing it. So I think ultimately in the longer term, this regime is terminal for that reason. But in what manner will they go and what will they be replaced by? This is the core question.
You have said, though, that all the bad guys have all the guns in Iran. So it's all very well to be a protester and they've made an impact. And as you say, the regime has lost the hearts and minds of potentially 80% of the population who don't want a bar of them but have to have a bar of them. But what would be the trajectory of the end of the regime? If you say it's in terminal decline, what is the terminus? How do we get there?
Unfortunately, looking at these kinds of regimes, it's often a splintering within the regime itself, where it undermines itself by splintering into multiple factions that ultimately weaken the whole and then lead to various actors pulling it apart. Often that can lead to something worse emerging than what might have existed before. Certainly doesn't necessarily lead to democracy or, what the protesters might want for their country. This could be an unintended consequence of taking out Ali Khamenei and Mujtaba, his son, not being able to effectively lead the country. You're going to have all kinds of we already do have shadowy people behind the scenes, all claiming to be the guy in charge, all claiming to control the faction that has the most guns and the most influence. We know there are multiple factions within the IRGC, and there's also big rivalries between IRGC and other armed groups, including the Artesh, the mainstream military. So over the longer term, we're also seeing the hardliners very much take over the state. And there was always this kind of almost artificial attempt, and I think the Supreme Leader very much orchestrated it, to play hardliners off against so-called moderates within the regime itself, and therefore let a bit of steam out of the system when it built up too much, when the pressure got too high. That's sort of gone now. You've just got hardliners in charge, IRGC in charge essentially. And they're very inflexible. They don't give an inch. And so even in their control over the civilian population and even within the regime itself, they're inflexible. So that might lead to a splintering in the end as well. But I think the events of January showed us that peaceful, unarmed protest cannot dislodge these guys. They are willing to fight to the very end and kill however many innocent people and women and children and whoever that it takes to retain their grip on power. And the Iranian population have learnt that lesson too. So they are, I'm sure, rethinking their approaches as well. We probably will see more protests, but will we see the same kind of protests that we saw in the Woman Life Freedom Movement 2022 or on the streets in January of this year? I'm not sure, because the regime has shown it has no red lines. And therefore, the risk profile for any Iranian seeking to take to the streets now has gone up massively. So,
a question here from Azadeh Fezpour, continuing this line of inquiry, and I guess the question that she's asked that you perhaps haven't answered directly is there any hope for the everyday citizens in Iran? I mean, do you think you're sort of describing like a kind of internal suicidal battle between the different factions that ends in some terminal decline, but is that the hope for the everyday people of Iran?
I don't think the Iranian people would hope for that. I mean, they want the regime gone, period, no matter what. But I don't have a positive outlook for the immediate future of Iran, but longer term I am more positive. I think the fundamentals are there for a flourishing country. You've got an extremely educated population that does not, by and large, adhere to the values of the regime. It's more open-minded. It's, Western-oriented in its values, not extremist at all. Most people abhor terrorism, abhor anti-Semitism, abhor the sort of crackdown on violence that you see on its own civilian population from this regime. So the values and the education and the nationalism and the desire, the love for Iran, the desire to build a better Iran and a future for their country, it's all there.
I'm going to betray my viewing preferences, but I recently watched I think it was Apple TV series Tehran, and I was actually quite surprised at how sophisticated elements. I mean, it's obviously an Israeli show. It's portraying a particular style of Iranian life that the Israeli producers want to portray. But, people are dressed exactly as we are. They're having parties in beautiful houses with all the beautiful cars. And, this is obviously the elite of Iran. But this sort of idea we don't see in the Western portrayal of Iran and the hardline negotiators. This is a very different Iran, the Iran portrayed by Hollywood.
I mean, I watched a couple of episodes of the first season of Tehran and I was just like, I can't watch this. It's so inaccurate.
Yeah, okay.
but that was more like, the IRGC would never say that, or they would never wear that, or, overall, I was impressed by the streetscapes.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they've been using obviously AI and whatever to replicate genuine Tehran streets or parks or whatever, but I remember thinking, that actually does look a lot like Tehran. I don't know where they filmed it, but...
Greece.
Oh, in Greece.
In Greece,
Athens.
yes.
Interesting. Yeah. But the plot line was a bit silly. I didn't think it was... I haven't seen subsequent seasons. So.
Okay, well, good to know. Good to know that I was completely misled. A question here from Dan Flitton. Iran has been urging BRICS countries to press for a ceasefire, but the grouping has been largely silent. That's true. Will Iran end up with less friends, particularly Russia and China, as a result of this conflict?
I mean, BRICS and Russia and China are two separate entities. BRICS, I think, is more just an economic grouping and a very loose one at that, particularly after they expanded it and included countries like Iran. Russia and China, though, obviously Russia has been constrained in the support it can give militarily to Iran because of the war in Ukraine, but it has given some support, particularly, I think, with sort of targeting GPS and satellite and targeting US bases in the region, as has China. And there's been some alarming reports of China transferring missile technology and anti-aircraft launchers that have mounted on the shoulder to Iran, fertilizers and chemicals that can be used in missile technology as well. So flouting the US sanctions on Iran to transfer that as well. So they have been assisting, but I think, they've been trying to stay a little bit in the shadows and haven't overtly come out in some kind of military alliance with Iran or whatever, but they are assisting. And obviously Iran sells, I think 90% of its oil goes to China. Again, it's sanctioned oil on the black market. So if that was cut off, and that's why this blockade could potentially be quite effective if it's sustained in the long term, because if that key economic lifeline's cut off, I mean, the economy is already essentially collapsing, but without that oil revenue, Iran wouldn't be able to fund any basic services at all.
Have you been surprised how reluctant the NATO allies of the United States have been to get involved?
No, I think it was rational, given Trump's treatment, given the tariffs, given the Greenland thing, given his rhetoric toward NATO and toward his European allies in particular, toward Canada too. I mean, why on earth, as a government of any of these countries, would you want to jump into this somewhat reckless military adventure alongside Trump after he's been bashing you for the duration of his presidency and also threatening to pull out of NATO and not to stick to his obligations? So I think you could see some of them have tread more carefully with Trump than others. Some of them have sort of put their foot in it a bit as well. I mean, I'm thinking Keir Starmer at the very beginning of this war too. But I'm not really surprised. We didn't really see an attempt at coalition building from the Americans
he didn't even
anyway.
tell them
Exactly.
after it had started.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
James Gray has asked, is there a strong connection between the Guards and Shia Islam?
Oh, yes. I mean, the brand of Islamism of the Islamic Republic of Iran is very Shia. This is the quintessential Shia Islamism being promoted out of Iran. The idea of the export of the revolution, which was Khomeini's idea following the 79 takeover of the state. It's not some universalist Islamic ideal, although sometimes they have played into that in some of their messaging. It is very anchored in Shia Islam. And I mean, there's been jokes going around that Mujtaba is in occultation, which is what they call the 12th Imam in Shiism. Imam al-Zaman, Imam al-Mahdi, he's gone into occultation. So he's not dead, he's in hiding from the world, and he will come back and reveal himself at a later point. So he's still the leader, technically, of the Shia community. This is the joke that the Supreme Leader himself has gone into occultation. So it's a very Shia entity. And in prison, we would have to commemorate all of the Shia religious holidays, in addition to stuff like Ramadan, which is across all of the sects of Islam. But the martyrdom day of every Shia imam, the birthday of Hazrat Fatimah, the Prophet Muhammad, all of the imams, and they would do Azadari processions inside the prison on Ashura. So very, very much is, I guess, in short, my response.
Yeah. A question here from Helen. If you could go back to the moment before your arrest, what would you want people around the world to understand about freedom, trust, and how quickly life can change?
It really amazes me that everything can just turn on a dime, and it's sort of that sliding doors moment that you have. I think of myself in the queue in the airport, checking in for my flight, getting my boarding pass, just going through those everyday activities that people maybe even today in this room have done. I mean, you just don't even think about it. In my brain, I remember I was desperate for a coffee and I wanted to get to the lounge, get through security and go and grab a coffee and enjoy my last
few moments. It was a long wait for that coffee.
I mean, I didn't have a decent coffee for 2.5 years after that moment. The best I got were these terrible knockoff Nescafe 3-in-1 sachets that they would sell. There was like the Iranian brand version of Nescafe, even worse than an actual Nescafe. But I still drank it because it was better than nothing. But yeah, shocking. But good tea. The tea, and even in prison, the Iranians, they love their tea and their biscuits. And I was bizarrely hosted for tea and biscuits once by the top judiciary official of Evin Prison, and he served it with a saucer and a cup, the biscuit on the side, and I got to sit and have my little cup of tea wearing my prison uniform and chador in his offices. They're really big on tea, yeah.
There you go. Another question from Stephen Carter. Will the actions of the Israelis and the US lead to the demise of Hamas and Hezbollah?
I don't think, it depends what you mean by demise. Certainly degradation, but you can't really wipe out an idea. I think as long as the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic regime is around, they will attempt to reconstitute all of their terror proxies in the region. It's harder for them now with Assad gone in Syria. They don't have that conduit to easily transfer weapons through to Hezbollah, but they had been trying to rebuild Hezbollah following that war with the pager attacks that we all remember from 2024, which was sort of joined onto the war in Gaza in a way for Israel. And I think the Israelis were surprised by the strength of Hezbollah this year, given that the Iranians were able to rebuild them a little bit in the meantime. So I don't think we're going to see them disappear, but they have been degraded. For how long? Who knows?
What about, though, the attacks on the Gulf states? Is there an impact from those attacks on the longevity of the proxies, Iran's proxies? I mean, because Qatar, for example, used to host Hamas, Hamas leadership. I mean, would they be willing to do that still, given what they've just experienced at the hands of Iran?
Well, this is really interesting, and it's too early to tell how the various Gulf states which have their own interests that aren't necessarily aligned with one another at all times, and Saudi Arabia, of course, how they are going to adjust their strategy and their foreign policy moving forward. Definitely we're going to see seismic shifts, I think, longer term in the strategic thinking of some of these leaders, and Qatar is obviously one of them. We have seen already some of the messaging change out of Qatar, particularly after that Ched gas field that they have with Iran was struck. This obviously is a disaster for them. I think it took a massive amount of gas offline for up to 3 years now. And we've seen some of the Al Jazeera editorial and other messaging coming out of the Qataris shift in a much more anti-Iran direction than it used to be. Obviously, Qatar was quite close to Iran. When Qatar went through that blockade masterminded by Saudi Arabia and UAE in about 2017, I think it was Iran that came to their rescue. And, you had airlifts of basic foodstuffs and other humanitarian aid coming to Qatar from Iran. So there will be shifts there for sure. But I think it's really too early. I mean, I have seen some UAE commentators floating the idea of closing the US bases in the country, for example, and pivoting or broadening their outlook to include potential adversaries of the US too, in order to hedge in the future if conflict was to break out again with Iran. So I think we're going to see a lot of shift, but rhetorically the leaders are currently during this time of war saying they're still firmly in the US camp and that, this has brought them closer together to the United States. But I do think we're going to see some daylight appear because at the end of the day, having those US bases in the Gulf has made them a target rather than the opposite, which was the thinking that it's going to protect them from becoming a target.
A question here from Caroline S. Do you think the historical, cultural ideologies and empirical hierarchies are integral in the ideologies and belief systems in the regions that are sort of, I guess, underpinning these geopolitical relationships? So I think the question is really, this is a kind of an ancient civilizations that end up inevitably clashing.
I don't think it's inevitable. I think when you have a sort of recalcitrant regime like Iran, like the Islamic Republic, it is kind of inevitable that they're going to clash with their neighbours, especially when they have a stated objective of exporting their revolution into neighbouring states. And when they have been meddling, particularly with Shia minority communities in those neighbouring states for quite some time, as well as establishing the proxies, not all of whom are Shia, but, this is again an attempt to exert power and influence regionally that other countries in the region might take a dim view of and might want to push back against. So in that sense, some sort of conflict is inevitable with their neighbours. But I don't think it's because of their civilization or heritage or the long-standing nature of, ancient Persia or Iran. I think it's more the ideology of this Islamist group, which has sort of captured the state and captured the country, but is actually a minority within the country. Iran is being ruled by an ideological minority, and I don't think they really have much connectedness to the great heritage of the Persian civilization. In fact, they often reject that narrative and embrace Islamic heritage more so.
Well, it was interesting. I think it was in January or February, there was a Iranian festival that people were trying, was it the Light or something like that?
Nowruz, the New Year festival,
and people were trying to celebrate that, but it was being clamped down upon because it was a Persian festival rather than an Islamic festival. And so that idea that we don't actually want the Persian heritage, we want this Islamic Shia heritage elevated.
Yeah, because Zoroastrianism was the traditional religion of Iran, and many of these festivals have its roots. I mean, I think that might have been Chahashanbe Suri, but the fire, jumping over the fire, they have their roots in Zoroastrianism. And obviously, if you're a Shia Islamist, you're not going to want people to celebrate what you see as a pagan rite or festival. They lost the battle with Nowruz. I mean, Nowruz is the Persian New Year. It's a big deal. I mean, it's celebrated by Kurds as well and other groups. It is such a big deal, even within the Islamist base, the core supporters of the regime. So they came to a kind of accommodation with no rules. I mean, this was explained to me in the prison. You would see in television propaganda, because I spent a lot of time watching state TV in my prison cell, they would have no rules propaganda. And traditionally, part of the kind of Haft scene, it's called the spread that you would have on a table. You have all these symbolic items. The Iranians would have a book of poetry. So they might have Ferdowsi, the Shahnameh or something, Hafez, a book on the table to celebrate their love of poetry. And poetry has a really strong role in Persian culture. So the regime started to promote to put the Quran there instead. And this was their kind of way of Islamizing Nowruz, having tried to stamp it out, failing, and then accepting that they're never going to. And in fact, they need to try and co-opt it instead.
Yeah. Well, Kylie Moore-Gilbert, thank you so much for joining us here today on Afternoon Light Live. It's been an incredibly stimulating and important discussion. History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.